The fine Hereford cattle, 24 of them, stood at the fence line with their heads hung low, their broad, dusty backs baked by a sun that had forgotten mercy. Their lowing was no longer a sound of pasture contentment, but a dry, rasping plea. On the other side of the wire was Elias's 100 acres, and beyond the cattle's uncomprehending gaze, a small herd of scruffy goats moved with an unnerving, placid energy. Mr. Sterling, owner of the cattle and the 10,000 acres of prime bottomland they were dying on, watched from his porch. He saw his wealth, his pride, his position in the county, evaporating into the shimmering heat. He saw that boy, Elias, moving among his worthless animals on his worthless patch of high gravel, and the sight was a stone in his gut. The boy's goats were not dying. They were not even thirsty. 9 months earlier, Elias had been the town's favorite fool. He arrived with little more than a strong back and a quietness people mistook for a lack of sense. He had enough money, saved from 3 years of working the rail lines, to buy the one piece of land nobody wanted. 100 acres of what the locals called the Scab. It was a raised, tilted plate of poor soil and rock that overlooked the rich valley floor like a beggar watching a banquet. The land agent in Prairie Fork hadn't even tried to lie about it. "It's high, son," he'd said, leaning back in his chair, a map spread between them. "The water table's a prayer that goes unanswered up there. No one's ever made a go of it. Good for rocks and rattlesnakes, and that's the long and short." Elias had walked it anyway. He'd knelt and crumbled the dry, gritty soil in his fingers. It was poor, no question. But the agent was wrong. It wasn't flat. It dipped and buckled in strange ways, with a long, shallow basin curving through its middle like a scar. He'd paid the man's price, which was next to nothing, and the deed was signed before noon. The news traveled through town like a cough in church. By evening, every man in the mercantile had an opinion. "Paid cash for the Scab," one said, shaking his head. "That boy's got more dollars than sense." Another laughed. "He'll be back down here begging work before the first snow." Elias heard them. He stood by the counter, buying a sack of flour and a side of salt pork, and their words slid off his stillness like rain off a slicker. He did not argue. Being right, he figured, was its own kind of reply, and he wasn't there yet. His first week was spent walking. He walked the boundary of his 100 acres, his boots scuffing on shale and kicking up puffs of pale dust. He learned its rises and its hollows, the way the wind scoured the high points and fell quiet in the low ones. He carried no tools, only a canteen and the habit of watching. He was 22, but his eyes were older, patient and accustomed to seeing what others overlooked. The valley below was a checkerboard of green corn and fat pasture land, bisected by a creek that ran full and clear. Up here on the Scab, the only green was the stubborn, waxy leaves of scrub oak and the tough, wiry grass that clung to life in the rock's fissures. It was a hard place. It was his. His only neighbor to the east was Mr. Abram, an old man who had come from a country of hard winters and harder soil. His farm was small but immaculate, a testament to a lifetime of careful work. Abram watched Elias from his porch for 3 days before walking over, his gait slow and deliberate. He didn't offer advice or pity. He just stood beside Elias, looking out over the basin. "They say this land is no good," Abram said, his voice thick with the accent of his homeland. "They are loud men. They think the land must shout its worth like they do." He squinted at the horizon. "But the best things are quiet. The seed in the ground, the water far below. You must learn to listen with your feet, not your ears." Elias nodded, understanding the truth of it. The next day he went back to town, not for work, but for livestock. He didn't look at the fine-wooled sheep or the solid, square-built cattle. He went to a man on the edge of town who kept a chaotic herd of what he called brush clearers. They were goats, a motley collection of 20 does and a single buck with coats of black, brown, and dirty white, and eyes of an unnerving, intelligent gold. They were nimble and coarse and reputed to eat anything from thistle to shirts left on a line. They were considered animals of last resort, a poor man's herd. "You want these?" the owner asked, disbelief plain on his face. "They're more trouble than they're worth. Can't fence 'em. They'll strip your place bare and move on." "I'll take them," Elias said. The price was, again, next to nothing. The mockery that followed him this time was louder, laced with a kind of pitying humor. The boy who bought the rock farm was now the boy with the goat herd. He was collecting worthless things. Elias drove his new herd up the rise to the Scab. The goats, freed from their crowded pen, flowed onto the land like water, spreading out, their hooves making small, sharp clicks on the stone. They ignored the dry grass and immediately began to browse on the scrubby, tough-leafed plants Elias had seen everywhere. They moved with a purpose he did not yet understand, but he was content to watch. That night, he made a cold camp in the basin. The stars were brilliant in the high, clear air. Below, the valley was a quilt of soft darkness, pricked with the yellow lights of farmhouses where people were sitting down to dinner, laughing about the boy and his goats. Elias ate his bread and salt pork, listening to the soft sounds of the herd settling around him. He began the arithmetic of survival, a habit learned from years of solitude. 1 man, 100 acres of poor land, 21 goats. He did not know the sum of it yet, but for the first time in a long time, it did not feel like subtraction. It felt like the start of a problem he was willing to solve. The first order of business was water. The goats were browsers, not grazers, and could get much of their moisture from the tough, waxy leaves of the scrub, but they would need more. There was no creek, no pond. The land agent was right about that. But Mr. Abram's words echoed in his mind. "Listen with your feet." So Elias followed the goats. For days, he did nothing but walk where they walked. They had a rhythm he slowly began to discern. In the cool of the morning, they ranged wide, stripping leaves with methodical tugs of their heads. In the heat of the day, something strange happened. They didn't seek the shade of the stunted oaks. Instead, they congregated, almost without exception, in the lowest part of the long, curving basin. They would lie there on the dusty ground, chewing their cud, perfectly calm while the sun beat down. Any other animal would seek shade. The goats sought this specific patch of bare, sun-baked earth. Elias knelt where they lay. The ground was packed clay, cracked into a mosaic by the heat. It looked no different from the ground 10 feet away. But when he pressed his palm flat against it, he felt it. A coolness. A deep, resonant coolness that had no business being there. It was the kind of cold that belongs to a cellar or a deep well. He dug with his bare hands at first, scraping away the baked surface layer. The goats watched him with their placid, horizontal pupils. An inch down, the dirt was still dry dust. 6 inches down, it was gritty and dark. A foot down, his fingers hit dampness. It wasn't mud, not yet, but a cool, definite moisture that clung to his skin. He stood up, his heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. It had worked. He had listened. He spent the next week with a shovel he'd bought in town, an expense that earned him more knowing smirks. "Digging for gold on the Scab now, is he?" He ignored them. Day after day, he dug in the basin. The hole grew wider. deeper. The goats treated his excavation as a new and interesting feature of their landscape, occasionally peering over the edge as he worked. At 5 feet, the soil was thick, dark mud. At 6, his shovel struck rock with a dull thud. He cleared the mud away and found not bedrock, but a series of flat, layered stones. And from a fissure between 2 of them, a tiny, almost imperceptible trickle of water welled up, clear and cold. It wasn't a spring, it was a seep, a slow, patient bleeding from the heart of the rock. It was so meager that anyone else would have dismissed it. But Elias saw it not for what it was, but for what it could become. It was a source. And a source, no matter how small, could be gathered. He spent the next month turning the hole into a cistern. He dug wider, deeper around the seep, creating a basin 10 feet across and 7 feet deep. He used the rocks he dug out to line the bottom, and then he began the back-breaking work of lining the sides with clay. He found a thick deposit of it on the western edge of his property, and for weeks, his entire life was the rhythm of digging the heavy, wet clay, hauling it on a makeshift travois, and packing it, handful by handful, against the walls of his pit. The sun baked his back and turned his hands to raw, cracked leather. He worked from before first light until he could no longer see. The town left him alone. The joke had grown old, and now he was just an oddity, the boy who lived on the hill and dug in the dirt. But one person did not leave him alone. A boy named Finn, the 10-year-old son of a farmer in the valley, began to appear at the edge of the property. He was a thin, quiet boy with eyes that missed nothing, and he'd watch Elias work for an hour at a time before disappearing as silently as he'd arrived. One afternoon, Elias looked up from the pit, sweat stinging his eyes, to see Finn standing there with a tin pail of water. "My mother said you must be thirsty," he said, not meeting Elias's eyes. Elias climbed out of the hole, took the pail, and drank deeply. It was the first kindness he'd received since arriving. "Thank you," Elias said. "Your mother is a good woman." Finn just shrugged, but he didn't leave. He watched as Elias went back to packing the clay. "What are you building?" he finally asked. Elias paused. He had told no one. The water was his secret, a coal banked low under ash, not ready for the world's wind, but looking at the boy's earnest, curious face, he felt a kinship. "A cistern," Elias said simply, "to hold water." "There's no water up here," Finn stated, repeating the town's gospel. Elias just smiled and pointed toward the seep. "There is. You just have to be quiet enough to find it." He let Finn peer into the hole to see the slow, steady welling from the rock. The boy's eyes went wide. From that day on, Finn was his shadow. He would arrive after his chores were done, helping in whatever small ways he could, hauling rocks or bringing Elias food his mother had packed. He never spoke of the cistern to anyone. It was their secret. He also, to Elias's surprise, had a knack for the goats. He learned their names. Elias had named them all, from the placid old doe he called Beatrice to the troublesome young one named Clover, and they treated him with the same calm acceptance they gave Elias. By June, the cistern was finished. The seep, slow but relentless, began to fill it. The water rose an inch a day, a mirror of pure, cold blue at the bottom of the clay-lined bowl. Elias built a low stone wall around it and a crude wooden lid to slow evaporation. He had water, hidden, secret, and entirely his. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky bleached to a pale, hazy blue, and the rains, which had been sparse, stopped altogether. In the valley, The creek shrank from a brisk flow to a sluggish crawl. The lush green of the cornfields faded to a tired yellow-green, the leaves curling at the edges. The ranchers, like Mr. Sterling, watched the sky with a familiar, anxious dread. Their prime grazing land, so rich in the spring, was becoming a problem. Thousands of acres of pasture required thousands of gallons of water, and the earth was no longer giving it up. On the Scab, however, a different economy was at work. The scrub oaks and other tough plants the goats favored had deep taproots, reaching for moisture far below the surface. They were not thriving, but they were surviving. And the goats, with their efficient, browsing ways, were fat and content. Their coats shone. The cistern was now more than half full, a hidden reservoir of nearly 1,000 gallons of cool, clear water. Elias had built himself a small, sturdy sod house near the basin, its thick walls keeping out the worst of the heat. He and Finn had even cultivated a small garden in the shade of the house, watering it by hand with buckets from the cistern. They had greens and beans and squash, a small patch of impossible life on the barren land. The contrast between the Scab and the valley grew more stark with each passing day. From his high ground, Elias could see the dust rising from Sterling's fields as the cattle milled restlessly, their grazing depleted. He could see the worry in the way the farmers walked their fence lines. The mockery had long since faded. Now, when he went to town for supplies, he was met with a new kind of attention, a sharp, searching curiosity. They saw his calm face, his lack of worry. They saw the sack of fresh beans he sold to the mercantile owner for a good price. They didn't understand it. A thing is only worth what others will pay, and for years his land was worth nothing. Now it was producing food when the best land in the county was failing. It was a puzzle they couldn't solve, and it unsettled them. One afternoon, a wagon belonging to a circuit merchant, a man who traveled between the towns and the distant city, broke an axle at the base of the rise to Elias's land. The man, a portly, sweating fellow named Miller, walked up to ask for help. His team of horses was lathered and distressed, their tongues thick with thirst. "Son," he said, mopping his brow, "any chance you've got a bucket of water to spare for my team? The creek down there is more mud than drink, and I'm in a real bind." Elias looked at the man's exhausted animals. "I've got water," he said. He led Miller and his horses up to the basin. When he lifted the lid off the cistern, the merchant stared, his jaw slack. The sight of that much clean water on this forsaken patch of land was like a mirage. Miller let his horses drink their fill, their deep, shuddering gulps the only sound in the hot, still air. He splashed water on his own face, sighing with relief. "I don't understand," he said, looking from the cistern to the healthy goats and back again. "Everyone says this place is a wasteland." "Everyone is wrong," Elias said, not with pride, but with the simple finality of a proven fact. Miller was a man of business. His mind worked in columns of profit and loss. He looked at Elias's goats, at their sleek sides and the full udders of the does. He looked at the impossible green of the small garden. He was a buyer and a seller, and he recognized value when he saw it, especially when it was where no one else expected it to be. "You make cheese?" Miller asked abruptly. Elias had been experimenting, using the surplus milk. He'd made a few small, hard wheels of salty, tangy cheese, storing them in the cool of his sod house. He brought one out. Miller sliced off a piece with his pocket knife, smelled it, and put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly, his eyes closed. "Good Lord," he breathed. "That's remarkable. The herbs in it, what is that?" "Just what the goats eat," Elias said. Miller's eyes lit up. "In the city," he said, his voice dropping with excitement. "The fancy restaurants, they'd pay a fortune for this, for something authentic. Cheese from the high prairie, we'll call it, made from goats fed on wild herbs." He looked at Elias, a new respect in his gaze. "I'll buy every wheel you can make, and I'll pay you $1 a pound for it." $1 a pound was more than what the finest cheddar fetched in the valley. It was a city price, a price that didn't belong in their small, struggling world. It was vindication in the form of a coin. Elias just nodded. "I'll have more for you on your next trip." The encounter changed something. Miller, with his broken axle and thirsty horses, was the first outsider to see the truth. He was the first to convert mockery into a signed order. As he helped the merchant fix his wagon, Elias felt a shift. His secret was no longer just a private victory. It was becoming a commodity. And that, he knew, would bring a different kind of attention, the most dangerous kind. It was Mr. Sterling who brought it. The powerful rancher had watched Miller's wagon leave. He had seen the merchant's animated conversation with the boy. Sterling was not a stupid man. He was a proud one, and his pride was tied to the productivity of his land. His land was failing. His cattle were growing thin. He rode up to Elias's fence line a few days later, mounted on a fine bay horse that was itself starting to show the strain of the drought. He didn't dismount, a gesture of casual superiority. "Boy," he called out. Elias was mending a section of his fence. He finished twisting the wire before he straightened up and looked at Sterling. "Heard you found some water up here," Sterling said, his tone a mix of feigned nonchalance and suspicion. "Enough for my goats," Elias replied evenly. Sterling's gaze swept over the property, lingering on the green smudge of the garden and the low roof of the sod house. His eyes narrowed. He was a man used to owning the best, and the sight of this scrabbly plot outperforming his own prime acreage was an insult. "You know," Sterling said, leaning on his saddle horn, "a man alone can't manage a place like this. It takes resources. It takes capital." He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "I'd be willing to take this hard-scrabble 100 acres off your hands. Pay you a fair price. More than you paid for it, certainly. Give you enough to get a fresh start somewhere more suitable." It was an offer wrapped in a threat. The message was clear. You don't belong here. This success is an anomaly, and it should belong to me. Elias looked at the man on the horse, at the fine boots and the expensive hat, and felt no fear, only a great, calm certainty. "It's not for sale," he said. Sterling's smile vanished. "Everything's for sale, boy. You do well to remember that." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly on Elias's side of the fence. The quiet war had begun. By the 3rd week of August, the creek in the valley was gone. It was nothing but a cracked, serpentine scar of dry mud and sun-bleached stones. The communal wells in Prairie Fork were running low, rationed to a few buckets a day per family. Panic, a dry and scratchy thing, had begun to settle over the valley. The farmers' faces were tight with it, the ranchers' voices sharp with it. Hunger changes a town, but thirst changes it faster. It strips away politeness and leaves only the raw nerve of need. Sterling's cattle were the first to truly suffer. They were big animals, bred for rich pasture and abundant water, and the drought hit them like a hammer. They spent their days crowded against the fence line that bordered Elias's property, their mournful calls a constant grating chorus. They could smell the water from the cistern, a scent carried on the hot, dry wind. They could see the green. It drove them mad. Sterling, his pride warring with his desperation, tried to drill a well. He brought in a team from the city with a steam-powered rig. For a week, the chugging of the engine and the rhythmic clang of the drill echoed through the valley. They went down 50 feet, then 100, then 200. They found nothing but dust and shale. The failure was public and expensive, and it soured him completely. His gaze turned permanently toward the scab. He began to talk in town, his words poisonously casual. He spoke of old water rights, of how a spring on high ground rightfully belonged to the lands below it. He hinted that Elias was a hoarder, a selfish outsider taking what belonged to the community. "It's not right," he'd say at the mercantile, his voice pitched for all to hear, "that one man sits on a fortune of water while his neighbors' livelihoods wither and die." Some, desperate themselves, began to listen. The same men who had mocked Elias for buying the land now looked at him with a new kind of resentment. It is easier to believe a thing is stolen than to admit you were wrong to mock it. Elias knew what was happening. Finn, his small, faithful correspondent, brought him the news from town. "They're saying you should share it," Finn said one evening, his face troubled. "Mr. Sterling says the water is for everyone." Elias was sitting by the cistern, watching the bats dip and weave in the twilight, sipping at the surface. He ran the arithmetic in his head, a constant looping calculation. The water level had dropped. The goats, the garden, his own needs, they all took their daily toll. The seep was steady, but it was slow. He had enough for himself. He did not have enough for the whole valley, not for free, not for a man like Sterling. One night he was woken by a noise, a clatter of stones and a frantic scrambling near the cistern. He grabbed the heavy axe handle he kept by his door and slipped out into the moonlight. Two of Sterling's ranch hands were there, trying to smash the lock on the cistern lid with a crowbar. They froze when they saw him, caught in the stark silver light. They were just men, their faces etched with the same fear he saw all over the valley. "He sent you," Elias said. It wasn't a question. One of them, a lanky man with a desperate look, nodded. "Our families ain't got enough to wash with, mister. The cattle, they're dying on their feet. He said there was water here." Elias looked at their faces, at their empty canteens. He saw not thieves, but men pushed to a desperate edge by a desperate master. His anger cooled into something else. "Go back and tell Mr. Sterling that this water is not his to take," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you two, you can fill your canteens before you go." He unlocked the lid and lowered the bucket for them. They drank, filled their containers, and left without another word, their shame hanging heavy in the air. The theft had failed, but the message was clear. Sterling would not stop. The crisis came to a head the next day. Sterling, his face a thundercloud of fury and thwarted pride, rode up to Elias's property again. This time, he was not alone. The town sheriff and two other prominent ranchers were with him. It was a show of force, an official delegation of the valley's power structure. "Elias," the sheriff said, his voice uncomfortable. He was a good man, caught in a bad position. "Mr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint. He claims this spring," he gestured vaguely toward the basin, "is a tributary of the old creek bed, and that you are illegally damming a public water source." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. The seep had no connection to the valley floor, but Sterling had the money and the influence. Elias had 100 acres of rock. "There is no spring," Elias said calmly. "There is a seep. I dug the cistern myself. The water is mine." Sterling sneered. "The water is under the land, boy, and the law is on the side of the community. We are in a state of emergency. You will open that cistern for the good of all, or the sheriff will open it for you." The two other ranchers with him murmured their agreement. Their own herds were suffering. They were willing to believe Sterling's lie because they needed it to be true. Elias looked past them, at the heat shimmer rising from the valley, at the skeletal forms of the dying cattle. He looked at the sheriff's worried face. He could fight. He could stand on his rights. And maybe, after a long and expensive legal battle he couldn't afford, he might even win. But he would lose something more important, the chance to build a community. He would remain the outsider, the man who hoarded water while his neighbors suffered. One person alone. He thought of Mr. Abram's words. He thought of Finn's quiet loyalty. He thought of the two ranch hands, their faces a mixture of shame and gratitude. He made his choice. "The water is not free," he said, his voice carrying in the still air. Everyone tensed. Sterling's face hardened, expecting a refusal. "But it is for sale." A collective sigh of relief went through the small posse. Sterling's expression turned smug. He had won. The boy was going to bargain. "Name your price, then," Sterling said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm sure we can come to a reasonable arrangement." This was the moment. He could gouge them. He could name a price so high it would make him rich and ruin them. He could have his revenge on every man who had ever laughed at him. The temptation was a bitter, coppery taste in his mouth. Instead, he looked at the sheriff. "The price is 5 cents a head for any animal that needs water, and $1 for any family to fill their barrels for their household, for the week." A stunned silence fell. 5 cents a head was nothing. It was a token, a gesture. $1 for a family's water was an act of charity. It was a price so low it was an insult to Sterling's greed. The rancher's face went from smug to purple with rage. That's ridiculous," he sputtered. "You could ask for 10 times that." "I know," Elias said simply. He turned to the other two ranchers. "That is my price. You can bring your herds to the fence line. My boy Finn and I will water them." The two men looked at each other, then at Sterling's apoplectic face, and then at Elias's calm one. They saw the truth of the situation laid bare. They saw greed on one side and generosity on the other. "That's a fair price," one of them, a man named Coulson, said gruffly. "More than fair." The sheriff nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. "The price is set, then." Sterling saw his power evaporating in the dry air. He had tried to use the law and the community to crush the boy, and the boy had used simple decency to turn the community against him. "I won't pay it," Sterling roared. "I won't be made a fool of by this goat herder." "That's your choice," Elias said. He turned and walked back toward his house. The matter settled. The meeting was over. The next morning, a procession began. It started with Coulson's herd, 100 head of thirsty, miserable cattle driven to the fence line. Elias and Finn worked all day, hauling bucket after bucket from the cistern, pouring it into long wooden troughs Elias had built. The sound of the cattle drinking was thunderous. Coulson paid in cash, his hand pressing the coins into Elias's palm with a look of quiet respect. "You're a better man than he is, son," he said, nodding toward Sterling's silent ranch. All day the farmers and ranchers came. They brought their milk cows, their work horses, their small herds of sheep. They lined up, paid their pennies, and watered their stock. The women came in wagons with barrels, and Finn, his chest puffed with importance, helped them fill their containers for the dollar fee. Elias's Scab, the joke of the county, had become its salvation. It was an oasis. The people who came were the same ones who had laughed at him in the mercantile. Now they didn't laugh. They looked at him with a kind of awe. They saw the hard-won results of his labor, the intelligence behind his strange choices. They saw that he had been right when they had all been wrong. And they saw that, given the chance to punish them for their scorn, he had chosen kindness instead. Mr. Sterling did not come. He held out for 2 days, his pride a fortress against the obvious. But his cattle were dying. The sight of his neighbors' herds drinking their fill while his own wasted away was a public humiliation more potent than any price. On the 3rd day, he sent his foreman, the same lanky man who had tried to break the lock. He came with a wagon, not with cattle, and a pouch of coins. He didn't meet Elias's eyes. "The boss wants to buy water for the herd," he mumbled, extending the pouch. 5 cents a head. Elias took the pouch. He didn't count the money. He just nodded. "Bring them up," he said. The victory was complete. It was quiet, without a single gloating word. It was simply the act of giving water to a defeated man's dying animals at the fair price he had offered to everyone. The arithmetic had changed. The sum of his assets was no longer just land and goats. It was respect. It was community. And that was a value no one could calculate. The drought broke in September, with a week of slow, soaking rains that filled the creeks and turned the valley's brown fields back to a hopeful green. The immediate crisis was over, but the memory of it lingered. The town of Prairie Fork was different. The easy arrogance was gone, replaced by a more sober understanding of how fragile their prosperity was. They had been saved not by the richest man among them, but by the poorest, not by the prime land, but by the worthless rock. Elias's life changed, but not in the ways people might have expected. The money he made from the water was significant, but he did not use it to expand, to buy better land in the valley. He invested it back into the Scab. With the help of Coulson and other farmers, who offered their labor freely, he deepened the cistern, turning it into a proper stone-lined well with a hand pump. They dug channels to irrigate a larger garden plot. The Scab was no longer a secret. It was a project. The cheese became a local legend. Miller, the circuit merchant, returned every month, his orders growing larger each time. He brought back news from the city of chefs who marveled at the taste of the high prairie, a flavor born of sun, rock, and the strange, hardy diet of Elias's goats. The goats themselves became a source of local pride. People no longer saw them as pests, but as symbols of a different kind of wisdom. Elias sold a few of the young kids to other farmers who wanted to try their own hand at raising them on the higher, rougher pastures. He gave them for a fair price, along with advice on their care. He was no longer just the boy on the hill. He was a teacher. Finn remained his constant companion. The boy had found a purpose on the Scab, a place where his quiet, observant nature was a virtue. He learned the rhythms of the animals and the land, and his parents, grateful for the water that had saved their own small farm, were happy to see him there. He was learning a lesson no school could teach, that value is often hidden, and wealth is more than just money. Mr. Sterling's power was broken. His public failure and subsequent humiliation had cost him more than the drought itself. He sold off half his herd and kept to himself, a diminished figure on his own vast lands. He and Elias never spoke again. There was nothing left to say. One cool evening in October, as the first hints of autumn color touched the scrub oaks, Mr. Abram walked over to share a cup of coffee with Elias. They sat on the bench outside the sod house, looking down at the valley, where the lights were coming on one by one. The well was full. The goats were bedded down. The air smelled of damp earth and contentment. You have good land now, Abram said, his eyes twinkling. Elias smiled. It was always good land, Mr. Abram. It was just quiet about it. Abram nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at Elias, at the young man who had come with nothing and built a life out of what everyone else had thrown away. The land speaks, the old man said, repeating the words he had spoken 9 months before. And you, my boy, you learned how to listen. Elias looked out at his 100 acres, at the rocky, tilted ground that had given him everything. He wasn't rich in the way Sterling was rich. He didn't own the best of anything by the world's measure. But his well was full. His animals were healthy. He had a place, a purpose, and the respect of the people who had once scorned him. He had listened with his feet, and the land had answered with a promise of water. He had listened with his heart, and the people had answered with a community. The arithmetic was finally complete, and the sum of it was abundance.